Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Sustainable Advantages podcast. I am here with Jason Massey from Industrial. Jason, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, Dustin. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Um, my name is Jason Massey. I'm one of the co-founders of Industrial and CEO and janitor, and whatever job is required in the startup. Started the company back in 2011, and we joke we're the oldest startup in the Raleigh Durham area. That's still grinding and still kicking.
I love it. You got to wear a lot of hats when early. So if you got to sweep the floor and also raise a fundraising, then
Got
that's
to
what it
do it.
is. Yeah.
Yeah.
So 2011, I guess that was we're 13 years ago already. So um,
Yeah.
13 years ago, what were you doing before you hopped into this?
Yeah. I'm a recovering internet bubble VC. I'd actually started my career after I left NC State, had moved up to New York, took the Wall Street job. At the time, we're still called stockbrokers. Now they're called financial advisors. Um, but that gave me a really fortunate time to go from that traditional kind of retail side of Wall Street to venture capital. Internet bubble was really heating up in the late 90s. I was able to transition into venture capital, and that got me out to Silicon Valley. So lived in Silicon Valley for about a decade. So I got to see the internet bubble crash, got to see all the down rounds and recapitalizations. I joke that was my MBA was going through that. And so towards the end of 2008 into 2009, we were thinking about moving home to North Carolina. So that was about the time that I made the transition. I'd left venture several years before. Most of the VCs that I had really admired had operational experience. They'd started companies. They had to hire and fire people and make payroll and do all those things that you need to do to build a business. So I thought if I ever wanted to be a great VC or come back to VC, I better go get some operational experience. So that's what prompted me leaving VC and then working with startups directly, and then ultimately moving back to North Carolina. Um, it was during that time, that transition period, that I I got to work with a small team. It was about five of us that worked directly with Al Gore to launch the climate project in China. So this is where Al Gore teaches people how to give the inconvenient truth PowerPoint presentation. So we negotiated with the Ministry of Science and Technology for about 2 years to get the agreement to allow Gore to come in and train 300 Chinese on how to give that presentation. And I think that was my wake up call around uh, how are we going to bend the curve on decarbonization and really tackle manufacturing and industrial type situations. That was brought me from being like an armchair quarterback environmentalist to really focusing in on things that I might be able to do to make a difference.
That's really interesting. There's a joke in there somewhere about Al Gore invents the internet, internet breaks, internet bubble bursts, and Jason's like, "Okay, Al, now what's next?" It's like, but that's cool. Like it's kind of like um, the first genesis of like a big climate movement
Yeah.
came from there. So you're kind of back from there. That's why you got into it.
Yeah, and unfortunately, because of Al Gore's involvement in that effort, it became too politicized, and sustainability and climate change took on some political leanings, and that was really interesting moving back to North Carolina to kind of see that. And when we started the business, like you really couldn't go into a factory in North Carolina and wag your finger and say Al Gore said clean up your factory. And so the good part about our business is it's a big tent. Like it actually, handles lots of different political ideologies, from folks that just really care about making American manufacturing more competitive, right, to folks that really do deeply care and are worried about climate change. We find that those things aren't mutually exclusive. Um, and I was friends with a it's actually a Belgian family that had moved to the United States to set up manufacturing. So if you've ever had a synthetic wine cork in your wine bottle, that probably came from the Noel family in Zebulon, North Carolina. And we had all read Ray Anderson's Radical Industrialist around sustainability. And that kind of served as our Bible when we started the company. And we used their factories in North Carolina as our initial guinea pigs to see if this would actually work, and could we convince a CFO that they needed to invest in things like sustainability, and that would be actually profitable for them to do. And that worked out really well.
That's really cool. Like, so the Zebulon, North Carolina, for people listening that don't live in North Carolina,
Okay.
not exactly like necessarily a hotbed of liberal politics.
Yeah.
And you guys jumping in and talking with them about sustainability, and there's synthetic wine corks at this factory. But what I find super interesting, and I guess this is a good time to introduce what Ndustrial actually does,
Sure.
is you're not leading with a message of let's save the planet. You're leading with the message of let us help you make some money, and save some money, help out your OpEx, get better at doing these. Oh, and by the way, this also helps reduce your carbon footprint, which increasingly is important with new like SEC rules and stuff about reporting. So yeah, in your words, can you define Ndustrial a little bit more?
Yeah. So what was really interesting during that time was the way we would pitch this type of stuff would be very financial, right? We would say if the IRR, the internal rate of return of this project, whatever you want to call it, energy efficiency, sustainability, if that internal rate of return is higher than the profit margin of your business, as a good steward of capital, you got to do that project, because there's no production line you could stand up. There's no additional widget you could make that would generate the same type of return as doing this project. So basing it in financial terms, and then to your point, the byproduct of success are all these other kind of components. But again, you can go back to true conservative principles, which is do more with less, don't waste a lot of resources. We would go in and after we do all these energy efficiency projects, we'd go in and be invited to do a talk during Earth Day at a factory. And we would talk about things like, when this factory opened, a barrel of oil cost X, now it's Y. And you keep your factory clean, why wouldn't you keep the earth clean and the environment clean? So we were able to make those connections in a very organic, authentic way. And you really didn't have to have these kind of like existential, political, ideological fights. But for us, when we started, we were doing the physical projects. And what we kept hearing from CFOs and leaders and plant managers of these facilities was like, great, but let's quantify your savings. And I want you to disaggregate that from my production processes. And we really looked at not building software, but maybe reselling. At the time, there was probably, and there still is, like 300 energy management software startup companies, big companies, small companies doing this stuff. And we were technologically savvy enough that when we looked under the hood of some of these products, what we found was they were very fine-tuned to commercial buildings, but they weren't fine-tuned to industrial manufacturing sites. They didn't understand the relationship between making the widget and how that would impact the energy usage or the kilowatt demand load of that facility. And so that was when we decided to effectively build the product ourselves. A lot of interesting epiphanies that came out of that effort, so that we could focus in on things like production normalized energy intensity. What's the kilowatt hours per widget in that site? And then that opens up a lot of really interesting analysis and interesting ways to kind of change the profile of that facility. And that was the first real instance of what we call our context platform that allowed us to contextualize very disparate data sources into some interesting insights.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, when I saw it the first time, I'm like, okay, energy intensity. Like I saw this in like a high school physics class, right? Like
Yeah.
it's not something that is necessarily deeply profound when you first look at it,
Yeah.
and then at the same time, it's like this is pretty niche. Like you guys
Mm.
just looking at this in this industrial setting until you realize that every one of these factories or warehouses, they're snowflakes. Right? Every one
Totally.
of them is made to do a bespoke job that's pretty complicated, and adapting to understanding the story of energy intensity for each one of
Yep.
those is tricky. Which, like, so you're talking a lot about like making widgets, but a big thing that I noticed you guys talk a lot about is refrigerated
Mm-hmm.
warehouses and the waste there. And something that I was trying to rationalize was,
Mm-hmm.
do I need a deeper understanding to tell everybody to close the door because the cold air is getting out or hot air is rushing in my 95-degree outside Mebane, North Carolina chicken warehouse? Or can they just do that in a common sense way? Like, what do you see that happens um, with that deeper understanding?
Sure. So it's interesting. We use that term production, and it feels weird to say storing cold food in a warehouse is not the same as uh, you know making a synthetic wine cork. In reality, freezing something and holding temperature is that facility's production process. But then again, you can go a little bit deeper dive, and this is where this production data, what you would find in like a warehouse management system, is in other control systems is a lot of these sites are blast freezing food. So they're going in at negative 20 degrees, and maybe they're blast freezing chicken for 48 hours, or the forklift operators are forgetting to take the product out of the blast freezer and put it in storage. These are very energy intensive activities, production, that if you sped that up, you would dramatically reduce the energy intensity of that facility. So now we're back to general production themes like throughput. If you can increase the throughput um, of that site, you'll need to you'll need to install less blast freezers. You won't have to add on to the warehouse another 100,000 square feet. You won't have to add a new ammonia compressor to that site if you can impact the throughput of that facility or increase utilization, meaning put more chicken in the warehouse, right? You got all this wasted space sometimes. And if you could just re-rack the warehouse and put more things in there, again, doesn't look like energy efficiency type measures like you'd see with doing a lighting upgrade or an HVAC upgrade, but it has a actually greater environmental impact by playing around with utilization and throughput in those sites. It sometimes order of magnitude larger than the environmental impact of upgrading to LED lights.
Right, and it's not a capital investment; it's like a reprocessing or reorienting
Reprocessing,
process. Yeah.
yeah. And if there is a capital thing that needs to happen, we got to spend money. This kind of goes back to the original questions that we get from the CFO is disaggregate these things, do the attribution that oftentimes is really hard is this thing that I'm doing really impacting, or is it something else that I'm not measuring that's actually impacting my utility bill? Because the simple litmus test that we would do or ask folks, customers and even investors when we were out pitching for fundraising is, let's say I've got a factory that has $1 million utility bill this January, but last January had a $900,000 utility bill. Is it more or less efficient today than last year? Almost everybody will say, well, obviously it's less efficient because the utility bill is more. And then we would also follow up with, well, what if I told you that site doubled their throughput, right? Well, obviously it's more efficient
Yeah.
today than it was last year.
Yeah, that's why you want these like unit measurements as you go along
Exactly.
the process. It's really, I think it's pretty, as far as I have seen, a pretty unique approach actually,
Mhm.
and it makes sense that it's been in the startup world for so long.
Yeah.
Industrial has, because it's like refining this problem over and over again is complicated.
Yeah, and it doesn't pattern match to traditional venture capital B2B SaaS business models, and that's challenging. As a recovering VC, I know what the pattern match is supposed to be, and oftentimes when we're pitching investors, we'll quasi try to scare them away and go, "This is complicated." You said it earlier perfectly. Each factory is a unique snowflake. Every vertical is a unique snowflake. Anybody that tells you there's no customization in the industrial world is straight up lying to you. And our job is to build tech that's 80% extensible, and then that other 20% that's unique side by side or vertical by vertical. It takes less time, less effort, less cost to do some of those customizations. Because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is every factory has a unique equation, and we're trying to discover that equation, turn that equation into a digitization kind of filter for a variety of different analysis and ultimately automation that's going to happen in that site.
So the goal is not a lowest common denominator solution. It's kind of a tailored solution.
You want it to feel very bespoke to the customer, but the reality is this stuff is all the picks and shovels are about the same. The same effort or the same back end to, we worked with a company called Novozymes to help them dose enzymes, at a more effective rate for ethanol plants. And that optimization in terms of how you manage it and deploy it looks very similar to optimizing, a refrigeration system, right? Two completely different outputs, but the way you manage the APIs, the way you manage the data, the way you generate an output and send that output back to a control system, all that stuff is pretty much the same.
I think my favorite part of that answer is you telling me they're about the same, right? And looking to me for confirmation. I don't know, but that was pretty good. But yeah, I mean, if there is like some basic building blocks, then the software platform starts to make sense. Do you find any kind of customer that you wish that you could grab that you can't with the current building blocks that you have? Like, are there certain like automobile factories, for example, would they be a bad fit for the current situation and you'd build more picks and shovels, or is it?
Yeah, for us, it's, we just got through our first closing of a Series B round, and for us going vertical by vertical is just a resource constraint or subject matter expertise. We happen to get really good at cold chain, and we've had other customers in different verticals, but we really need to staff into some subject matter expertise so that we could confidently go into the cement industry. We constantly get asked, could we go into the data center market, right? It has a thermal load. It oddly behaves very similar to a cold storage warehouse. And for us, the answer is, with a high level of confidence, is yes, we could go into that space, but we gotta staff a team dedicated to that. We got to build some partnerships in that marketplace. So we've got confidence we can go vertical by vertical, but it's just we're very customer first centric organization, and if we don't feel like we can service that customer with their specific needs with a white glove approach on top of our technology stack, then we won't go into that vertical. But now that we've got some extra coins in our pocket, we've got the ability to expand into other verticals.
Yeah, and that tickles that VC bone that you had before, where you're like, oh yeah, software platform, I could scale up the new verticals pretty quick if I have the people who have the expertise, right?
Yeah, cold chain, we call it cold OS right now. But there's no reason that we work with a group like W.L. Gore on the textile and chemical side. There's, not a big jump to go to textile OS, right? And some other types of things. And again, most of the back end and those things are pretty common pieces of functionality. Like to ingest a utility bill and break it apart and all that stuff, that's going to be the same vertical by vertical. It's just when you get into some automation and optimizations, those are going to be more specific to the site and the vertical.
So in the verticals that you're in, like the cold chain part, I've seen talked about a lot.
Yep.
Do you have one where you went into a customer and they were like, "Oh no, this makes perfect sense. Let's just go do it. Like this is great," and you were like, "All right, we got this one. We nailed this vertical now, and we can kind of go." Or does it not really work that way because every one of them is so specifically individual?
I think what we found is we get pleasantly surprised when we go into a new situation. So it helps to have an entrepreneurial mindset that goes, we could do that, right? If we hit the wall, we'll figure it out, right? And so like we've got a massive tire recycling plant in Houston, Texas, a company called Geenan, and obviously never done tire recycling, never integrated with this particular ABB control system, but we knew we had enough of the building blocks that, and oddly enough, we had just hired a new integrations engineer who had experience with PLCs. And one of his first projects was working on that. And it was just a matter of weeks. And we didn't have to put any boots on the ground. We were able to read the control diagram from the ABB system, map out effectively all the significant energy users, which you'll hear people call SEUs, and then build a logic off of our existing demand response load control system that says, as the Texas ERCOT prices increase by X%, curtail 200 kilowatts. And then that system runs automatically. We're able to ship an edge device. They were able to install it, test it, make sure we wouldn't do anything to blow up the factory. And, we were pleasantly surprised at how straightforward that actually was. So that gave us the confidence to start, trying things that we normally wouldn't have done and just kind of stick to our knitting and things like cold chain.
Interesting. So I'm sorry, did you say you shipped a device or you
We don't
repurposed
make
a
any
third party? Okay.
we don't make any hardware. We off the shelf. We're, to get into the geeky weeds, we're very much a Dockerized code shop, so we can port a lot of our kind of cloud-based infrastructure pieces to the edge, and use a variety of different edge devices just depending on the use case. So our code can then reside on that. We create a safe relationship between that edge device and whatever legacy systems may be in place. So like in the cold chain, if we were part of an optimization loop and an algorithm sends a 32-degree set point to the refrigeration control system, the refrigeration control system wouldn't respond to that. They already have their checks and balances. So there's no way for us to like do something bad or have a food safety issue at that site. So we purposely set that up so that we're not trying to replace a refrigeration control system. We're just trying to augment that refrigeration control system.
I see. Okay. That's I mean, I would have thought that you were more analytics heavy before I started talking. Like, I think that when I read the website and for Ndustrial, I hear SaaS, analytics, we're going to tell you what to do. But it almost sounds like you're much closer to the customer than you would be if you were just like, hey, here's some software that can help you figure out how to do optimizations. So with that in mind, kind of how does that evolve? Is it just more verticals and geographies, or are you looking more at maybe we do want to ship some devices, or maybe we do want to do like some kind of new technology area, or maybe we just want to like get into policy and lobby people? like what is it?
It's a little bit of all of the above, but
Okay.
So there's, in cold chain, we call it a value stack. We can go up the stack even more. So because of the data that we have, we can get into fleet electrification and specifically get into things like trucking refrigeration unit electrification. So while everybody's attention is on these big Class 8 truck electrification. That little refrigeration unit that sits on the trailer while it's at the loading dock, that can be easily converted to kilowatt hours versus burning diesel and idling while the trailer is loaded and unloaded. So that's a direct emission thing. That's some additional SaaS revenue for us. But what you see from an evolutionary standpoint is we start with software as a service. Vast majority of our revenue it fits that pattern match of software as a service. But what we're effectively doing is contextualizing a baseline, understanding the operation so that then we could start to morph into managed services and ultimately energy as a service. Because once we have confidence in a facility, we may be able to go out and do a better job of arbitraging the energy markets, right? Whether that's through energy supply contracts, demand response, work with different partners to bring kind of push more value to our end user, our factory customers through that additional intelligence. So you're almost always going to onboard a customer, software as a service, bunch of reporting, data wrangling, getting organized around that. That has its own set of value, but ultimately you can see this to energy as a service. And then, yeah, there's enough horizontal pieces that we can do load control in different verticals. We're even in the oil and gas space with water filtration pump systems in Texas. So yeah, we see a lot of kind of vertical growth because of the horizontal pieces that we had in the back end platform. But on the policy side for us, it's interesting. We obviously would love to see more demands and conversion. But back to our roots of financially driven internal rate of return, right now, in things like trucking refrigeration unit conversion, it's just simple math. The cost of kilowatt hours is less than the per gallon cost of diesel. And so it just, without any type of California regulation, stick or carrot, incentive, tax benefits, IRA money, it just makes sense to do those independently. And then you get this massive emissions reduction. I would say the thing, call it policy and regulatory side, and maybe even the capital markets to take care of this that takes care of this itself, is carbon needs a price, right, at the end of the day. And it needs to be trusted, right? It can't be some weird forestry carbon credits type stuff. It's got to be, real quantified, methodical measurement and verification around, carbon reduction. And therefore we can put a price on carbon, because that's ultimately what we want to see here is a cost externality. Carbon is now on the books of a business in a very authentic way. The way, again, we're finance geeks as much as we are software engineers. When we tell a CFO that your utility bill, which is normally seen in your profit and loss, your P&L, as an operating expense, when we say that's really a COGS, a cost of goods sold, that changes the financial calculus very quickly for the way they plan and do things. And then what you're saying is effectively carbon is a cost of goods sold, right? It is actually part of what it takes to make this widget, and you need to consider it, and it needs to be on your financial statements. And so once carbon has a price that people feel is not manufactured or weird or manipulated, then it's game on, right? And this stuff gets a lot easier financially.
Yeah, it already makes sense to do some of the things, but it makes a ton more sense to convert that diesel generator on the truck when you also factor in the carbon price. It's like, why am I even doing this at all? It's setting money on fire. Yeah,
it's huge. It's so obvious. It's painfully obvious, right? Which is awesome.
Well, I guess the last thing that I'll say, and see if you have a reaction, maybe you'll cringe, is Industrial the future of virtual power plants? Is that what I'm hearing? You're going to do demand reduction? Is that where this is going?
Sure. We've used the term IVPP, Industrial Virtual Power Plant. I think And there are a lot of acronyms, DERs. I mean, it's just microgrid stuff, batteries. I mean, sometimes it's hard for us, much less our customers, to navigate all these terms. As we think of the virtual power plant world and the way it's been kind of set up, is they're much more uh, power generating, energy supply relationships. Right? They're typically more utility facing. We liken ourselves more as the behind the meter VPP, right? So our customer is the factory. We want to game the system on their behalf. But by doing that and aggregating that data and those loads and what's controllable and what's flexible, that does make it very compelling for the grid. And so you need like the utility facing VPP to be able to talk and interact with the behind the meters industrial VPP. And if we can build that glue and that connectivity, then I think we've done something meaningful on the VPP front.
I mean, that sounds like an exciting future to me.
It's fun. It's complicated. There's a lot of stuff inside the four walls of a building.
Wow. Like
knowing what
I
to do
tell
with
my
it.
kids, all the time, John F. Kennedy said, we do these things not because they're easy, but because they are hard.
It's spot on. We have a little mantra inside our company. It's like we run towards hard, right? Like because again, a lot of people won't do it. They want to try to build the lowest common denominator energy management tool that can address everybody. And what you find is when you overgeneralize, it's just not very valuable to any one group. And so, yeah, this stuff's hard. You got to run towards that, and that in of itself is a bit of a differentiated moat for a company like ours.
Well, that's fantastic. And Jason, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about all of this industrial software platform and all the other stuff that comes with it. It's a very interesting story.
Yeah, thanks for having me.